On June 1st, 2020, a staff member of color at a National Green Group shared a 17-page, heartbreaking, and vulnerable letter addressing the numerous ways she felt devalued, undermined, and set up to fail merely because of the color of her skin. 2 months later, on August 4th, another person of color at another environmental organization submitted her 2 weeks' notice, again stating that she felt devalued, undermined, and set up to fail because of the color of her skin. At that same organization, 2 days later, on August 6th, another person of color submitted her 2 weeks' notice, again stating similar reasons. These are not one-off instances. In my recent Transforming a Movement report examining environmental organizations, I found that almost 9 of every 10 staff members of color report similar experiences of feeling devalued and excluded. So what is the similarity among all these organizations? Well, these are staff members who are working in organizations actually doing internal diversity, equity, and inclusion capacity building. So as an environmental movement, yes, we have been evolving, especially over the past 6 years. However, we've not been good enough. Maybe it's because we've treated DEI capacity building efforts as a success in of itself without asking if these efforts are actually effective. Here's the beauty of this moment in time. Environmental organizations are stepping up, shining a light on root causes. Organizations are exploring and coming to terms with the racist past of the environmental movement and their organizations. They are the ones that are asking these questions. They are using terms like anti-racism, white supremacy culture, systemic racism, white fragility. They are ready to rise to the moment. But they need you. They need your partnership and your funding. Earlier this summer, Doris Duke Charitable Foundation released the first national open call to fund DEI capacity building in conservation organizations. They received a whopping 360 applications. They will only fund 30. So, what can you do to support this thirst, this rise in interest, and this rise in going deep into root issues among environmental organizations? How can you rise to this moment? Well, it happens I wrote a report called Transforming a Movement, How Funders Can Support Effective Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Capacity Building Efforts in Environmental Organizations. So after gathering data from organizations, staff of color, and foundations with actual DEI capacity building programs, I want to share 5 key takeaways for funders that will support effective DEI capacity building in this moment of time, and you're able to really advance and support and address systemic and institutional racism that has plagued us for too long in the environmental movement. So 1, what's the first key takeaway? Invest significant funds over the long term. Almost all environmental organizations are in the early stages of their DEI journey, no matter how long they've been doing this work. So I call these organizations DEI babies. They're babies because they need a lot of resources like food and attention at this early stage of growth. And it will take time to reach adulthood. So that's why we need to give significant funds over the long term. If you want a guiding number, about $20 million is needed at this moment for the organizations that will not receive funds in the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation program. Number 2, support organizations authentically committed to transformation. So what does that mean? That means supporting groups that are focused on effectiveness. Again, so what does that mean? The core areas of effectiveness defined in the report are centering the experience of staff of color. Staff of color and their experiences are the barometers of whether you're doing DEI capacity building well or not. Focus on the how, not the what. The how gets at to the quality of what the work is all about. You could do a training that's really well, and you could do a training that's done really badly. Focus on the how. And lastly, address systemic and institutional racism and shift to an inclusive and equitable culture. Third key takeaway for funders is build DEI capacity at your foundation. Do it in partnership with your grantees, do it in partnership with other foundations. Again, do it in an effective way. Center staff of color, focus on the how, address systemic racism, and shift to an inclusive and equitable culture. Number 4, hire an external thought partner. So if you're a foundation made of individuals that are 3s, 4s, or 5s on a 10-point scale, with 10 being exceptional at DEI, then the best your foundation will be is a 3, 4, or 5. So work with a DEI expert who can guide you to a 10. Number 5, so the last takeaway I want to share with you is to add support, give funding to people of color-led justice-focused groups working on environmental issues. The funders interviewed realized that achieving a more successful environmental movement and DEI capacity building means supporting environmental and equity outcomes. So if this is the case, then they need to fund the organizations that are already achieving environmental and equity outcomes. In this case, these are people of color led and justice focused groups. They've been doing this work for a while. They have experience. They figured out how to achieve both environmental and equity outcomes. So give them the funding that they need to do this well. So just as we talk about the interconnectedness of life, land, air, and water, the environmental movement is inextricably tied to this time of racial reckoning. This is our moment. The moment to take a long leap forward with the rest of society. And in doing so, we will successfully protect our planet on a level and scale we have never experienced. This is the promise of a diverse, equitable, and inclusive environmental movement. Will you rise to this moment with me?